I'm gonna take a drink of water. Throat's kind of dry. Oof. All right, good to go. All right, so this now takes us to the political portion of the podcast, which continues our read through of Plato's Republic, where we left off last time. In the coming weeks, I would like to do a special. Wait, nope, I forgot to edit that out of my notes. So I will not say that. Okay. Um, all right. Okay. So we'll start by recapping the last episode. So in the last edition of this podcast, I said that Polemarchus and Adeimantus were arguing with Socrates in the second book. It was actually Glaucon and Adeimantus arguing. So I apologize for that slip up. Glaucon and Adeimantus were the two brothers who put up the stories about the magic ring, and um, I don't remember the other one, but it wasn't Polemarchus. Polemarchus was only in the first book. We've only seen him in the first book so far. All right, so if you remember the last time, the Republic starts with Socrates being invited by some youths to a house where he finds an old man, Cephalus. They strike up a conversation on old age and whether it is old age itself or people's attitude towards old age that makes it onerous. Cephalus concludes that the ability to handle old age comes from being just, and defines it loosely as the speaking of truth and paying of one's debts. Um, this definition gets bandied around until it's finally concluded that speaking the truth and paying of debts can't be a proper definition of justice, since the harming of one's enemies and the benefiting of one's friends is a sort of thieving, since the harming of one's enemies and the sorry, let me back up there. I'm really sorry. I'm botching this. All right, this definition gets bandied around until it is finally concluded that speaking the truth and paying of debts can't be a proper definition of justice, since the harming of one's enemies and benefiting of one's friends, both is a sort of thieving and will result in the harming of one's friends and benefiting of one's enemies at least some of the time, because you don't know who your enemies or friends really are. So they're going on this line of discussion, pretty peaceful and quiet, and then Thrasymachus kind of barges in and argues that everyone's had it all wrong. That justice, it really is might makes right. Socrates eventually refutes him by showing him that justice means doing the bad and injustice the good. And then after that, Thrasymachus kind of storms out. But then Glaucon and Adeimantus, not Polemarchus and Adeimantus, Glaucon and Adeimantus pick up the thread and put out some really powerful arguments against Socrates' refutation. So, in the first place, this is Glaucon and Adeimantus in the first half of Book 2. In the first place, they argue that everyone is just only because they are made to be so by the state. Hello, Hobbes. Glaucon then brings up the example of a man with a magic ring, which would make him invisible, and argues that no sane man would resist the temptation to use it, since there would be no penalty for doing so. Frodo. Excuse me. He also juxtaposes an unjust man who is given everything in life and a just man who is given nothing and is eventually killed in an extremely painful way, and argues that no one would choose the just man. And the very interesting thing about this example is it's said that Plato that actually predicts the crucifixion about 300 or 400 years prior, because some translations translate it as impaled, but it could also be translated as will be crucified. So yeah, you can just imagine having everything taken away from you, just like Christ did. Would you choose Christ or the wealthy man that has everything he wants? It's a good good question. So yes, okay. All right, so now we come to the place where we left off last time. So after Glaucon and Adeimantus stop speaking, they beg Socrates to take the thread, and he does so by arguing that, and this is kind of an important analogy, that looking at big letters on a rock from far away can help us read the smaller letters on a smaller rock, with the big rock referring to the definition of justice in the city, and the small rock referring to the definition of justice in the individual. In this way, Socrates, instead of answering Glaucon and Adeimantus directly, proposes to investigate the origins of the city as a means to discovering justice in the state, which in turn he hopes to turn around and discover the justice in the justice in the individual. Um, yeah, so these yeah, so I told you this analogy that he makes between these two stones is kind of important. Um, this kind of assumption is sort of the foundation of Plato's work here. Um, there, how exactly Socrates proposes to examine these in the next few books are, no matter like what he's talking about, he's gonna be talking about like rhythms, proper music to sing, stories to tell the children, all of this seemingly unrelated stuff that doesn't seem like it would tie back to justice. But remember that no matter how off topic certain things may seem to be, everything Plato's saying here, or Socrates is arguing here, is all for the purpose of establishing these two principles. That justice in the individual is analogous to justice in the city, and that observing the origin of a city is the best way to find justice in the city. So I'll go over those two again. So the two foundational beliefs, foundational statements of Plato's Republic are that justice in the individual is analogous to justice in the city, and the origin of a city is the best way to find justice in the city. Okay, so in accordance with his plan, then, as we continue through Book 2, Socrates begins his proof by arguing that cities arise because we have many needs and are not self-sufficient. This constraint requires people to specialize in the craft they are best suited for, which in turn allows everyone else in the city to specialize in what they are best suited for. Sounds like Adam Smith. Plato then makes a distinction between the healthy and the feverish city and likens the difference as a difference between the healthy and feverish individual. We should examine, and here's beginning in quote, we should examine not only the birth of a city, but of a luxurious city. Yet to me, the true city is that which we described like a healthy individual. However, if you wish, let us also observe the feverish city. So in this luxurious city, Socrates argues that there will be need for many more services to cater to the luxurious taste of its inhabitants, such as swineherds, beauty parlors, barbers, to name a few. This increase in the crafts will require upkeep that is greater than if it wasn't a luxurious city, and it will also increase the number of inhabitants, eventually forcing the city to expand and force it into declaring war on others so as to be able to uh, house and feed all of its inhabitants. Um, Besides these specialized crafts, cities also require someone learned in the craft of war. This is a position Socrates calls a guardian. So every city needs to have a guardian. Having established how a city's birth leads to its growth, Socrates now turns to discuss this position of guardian for the city. Um, So he has this example where he looks at dogs and says, "Hey, look, like dogs are really aggressive versus people they don't know, but they're really, happy around people they do know." So the only distinction there, only the only reason why they're mad at other people and not mad towards their owner is because of a difference in knowledge. They know their owner. They don't know the random guy on the street. Um, so Socrates argues that dogs love knowledge, that they are wise in that way because um, uh, because loving knowledge is analogous to loving wisdom, and he argues that the guardians must be dogs in this sense, like they must protect their city with, you know, uh, as much tact and stuff as they can, and they've got to be ferocious, but they've also got to be ferocious and unyielding in war. Um, okay, so turning over to the education of the Guardians, how do we make them virtuous? How do we make them lovers of wisdom from the very start? Socrates argues that stories told in the city must be heavily restricted so as to properly mold children's lives. Um, oof. Socrates argues that since God is good and nothing good is harmful, and nothing harmful causes harm, and what does no harm can do no evil, that God can't be the cause of anything evil. Um, Let me go over that again. Socrates argues that since God is good, nothing good is harmful, nothing harmful causes harm, and what does no harm can do no evil, that God can't be the cause of anything evil. Thus, Socrates says all stories about God must conform to this basic tenet. Um, Additionally, Socrates argues that since God is perfectly good, any change he undergoes must necessarily be a change for the worse. Um, Therefore, because he can't change himself, he cannot deceive others or misrepresent himself. And I'm really excited to share this to you guys later on. But this concept of God not being able to change himself comes up in Plotinus, who was also a Neoplatonist in the third or fourth century AD, and he argues for the existence of God using this divine simplicity. So yeah, we'll definitely be returning to that idea. Okay. All right. So let's wrap things up here, um, and we'll do like a brief recap here because I'm a little over time. In conclusion, then, let's show how the argument presented here traces back to Socrates' assertions that justice in the individual is akin to justice in the state, and that an examination of the origins of the state should lead us to the justice in the state. Remember, those are the two principles that you got to hammer into your head. Justice of the individual is analogous to justice of the state, and justice in the city, or sorry, justice in the individual is analogous to justice in the city. In the wait, sorry, let me back up. Justice in the city is analogous to justice in the individual, and the birth of a city is how we determine whether a city is just or not. So if we examine the birth of a city, then we should be able to see justice as it is growing and as it exists in that city. Um, so in this last half of book two, which has been presented here, he's this is his attempt to prove that by laying out the origins of the city like he did, that we will now be able to see justice more clearly. And he will go on in book three to argue to examine justice in a little further. So in terms of the birth of the city, he argues that a city comes from a division of labor between its inhabitants who need each other since they are not self-sufficient, meaning they can't sustain themselves. There's also the feverish city, which requires even more crafts and tends to use up resources, leading to a need for war against surrounding neighbors. As protection against the enemy, then, the city needs guardians trained in the arts of war. This, in turn, requires all impious stories about the gods to be scrubbed, and only those stories which paint God as good and true to be admitted, and not deceitful. Thus we see that the city is composed of mutually dependent citizens, and not a tyranny over people not strong enough to do evil, as Thrasymachus argued. Remember, he argued that people are just only because they are made to be so. Whereas here Socrates is saying, no, they are mutually dependent on each other. They need each other. No one man is self-sufficient. Um, so, despite this, even though he's answered Thrasymachus' objection, he still has a ways to go to address Glaucon and Adeimantus's examples of the invisible ring and the wealthy unjust man versus the poor and tortured just man. So next week we will see how he proposes to do this by examining the ideal character of guardians. And yeah, I'll end with that. So I guess homework for the politics section, see if you can remember what the two arguments central to Socrates' theory of justice are. And just mentally in your head, see if you can formulate those. If not, then try going back earlier in the video because I mentioned it quite a bit. All right, well, that will do it for politics, and I think it is now time to